I'd like to welcome everyone tonight to this podcast about degrowth, the audience. I'd also like to thank Susan and Jason. A special thanks to Leo, who's doing the translation into German. It's really quite a feat, and she does this alone for the whole 2 hours. Then, of course, thanking the Helle Panke Foundation and the Rosa-Luxemburg-Foundation for their support. Without them, we could not do these podcasts. And then I'm supposed to instruct the Germans the following things. I'll say it in German. Wenn Sie Deutsch sind, können Sie einfach auf rechts ist ein Dolmetschen Icon. Drücken Sie einfach drauf und dann kriegen Sie das Deutsche. When everyone has any questions, please go to for the Anglo-Saxons Q&A, for the Germans F und A, für die Deutsche, das sind Fragen und Antworten, genau. So, da stellen Sie Ihre Fragen. All right, I think that's all the formalities. Oh, the last thing, which is a personal thing for Brave New Europe, of which where I work and who's actually organized this, is we are in our fundraising for 2020. I'll be quite frank, it's a disaster this year due to COVID. So if you have an income, which a lot of people don't have right now, please consider donating. You'll find it on our website. I put in the first chat notice, and then just go to our website and go to donate. All right, before we begin, I want to say one thing about what I'd like the evening to go. And that is, I'm hoping by the end of the evening, you'll leave this discussion convinced about degrowth. I'm pretty much sure among progressives, there's a consensus right now that degrowth is an integral part of stopping climate change. I don't think there's really much debate anymore. Thus, I'm hoping that's where we're going to arrive at by the end of the evening. You know, you don't have to be convinced, but at least that you'll start looking at the possibilities. I forgot to bring them, but both participants have just brought up what I think are very, very good books about degrowth. On the other side, and this is the important part, is we are not going to win anything on Zoom or on Twitter. And right now in Europe, I can say that I do know what's going on. That's what we do. We follow these things, that we are not getting a Green Deal. We are getting a Brown Deal. This is being spearheaded by Germany, which also happens to have the president of the Commission is German. A lot of the crucial people are German. And what we're going to see, just that you know what's coming, after the great financial crisis, everyone asked, how did it happen that all these banks that caused this financial disaster in the end received hundreds of billions of dollars or euros? We're going to see the same thing now in Europe, that all these corporations, be it fossil fuels, airlines, airports, you name it, they are going to receive hundreds of billions of euros and will be saved, and the problem will not be solved. If you want just a taste of what's coming, on our website, there's a very, very good article from Corporate Europe Observatory about hydrogen fuel. Read it. It's so explicit and so simple to understand what's going on. And what it is Germany, who's very involved in liquid gas, what they're going to do is create hydrogen fuel with gas. There's a loss of 40% of energy. That means first we have the gas industry making an enormous profit, and then the hydrogen fuel industry. And we're wasting energy. We're creating more CO2 having hydrogen-powered cars than we would have if we just had them going on gas. So do have a look, and you get a feeling for the whole hypocrisy, the whole profit orientation that is driving the German, and of course, what's as hegemon, it's the EU Brown Deal. And that's it. We'll start with Jason. Thank you very much.
Okay, here we go, I guess. First of all, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you again for inviting me back there, Matthew. And I'm so sorry we can't be doing this in person, but maybe this is better in the end. I think we have an exciting topic on the table tonight, and I'm looking forward to engaging with your questions, which is really why we're here. So I'll keep my remarks to about 15, maybe 20 minutes at most, and we'll see where we go. So there are a number of different ways to approach the topic of degrowth. But what I want to do tonight is start with the problem of ecological breakdown, since this is clearly at the forefront for many of us these days. And of course, we already know about the reality of climate change. This is finally starting to capture headlines. But it's important to recognize that the crisis we face is much broader than climate change alone. We're overshooting a significant number of planetary boundaries, and key Earth system processes are in danger of breaking down. And we see this in the form of things like rates of deforestation and land use change that's degrading ecosystems, chemical loading in soils and in waterways and the seas, soil depletion. We know that 40% of the planet's topsoils are seriously degraded, and at existing rates of soil degradation, food security this century will be under severe threat. Ocean acidification is a major problem, and of course, species extinction, with rates of species decline up to 1,000 times faster than prior to the Industrial Revolution. So on our present trajectory, with business as usual, we're looking at 30 to 50% of species are projected to go extinct by the end of the century. Hundreds of millions of people will be displaced by the effects of global warming and other effects of climate change, triggering widespread social instability. Access to food will be severely constrained, with yields of staple crops projected to decline by in the region of 30%, again, this century. The UN warns of what they call multi-breadbasket failures and sustained food supply disruptions globally, with famine striking a number of different regions at once, making them difficult or impossible to manage. So we refer to this as the Anthropocene, an era where human impact is reshaping biophysical processes at a planetary level. But the language of the Anthropocene actually has it wrong. It's not humans as such that are causing this crisis. Rather, it's being driven by our economic system, which is capitalism. So as Jason Moore puts it, this era is better described as not the Anthropocene, but the Capitalocene. Now let me specify as clearly as possible what I mean by capitalism here. When people think about capitalism, they quite often just typically believe that it has to do with markets or trade and businesses and so on. But this isn't exactly accurate. Capitalism is a system that's only about 500 years old, whereas markets and trade and even businesses existed for many hundreds of years before this. So what makes capitalism distinctive is that it's organized around and dependent on perpetual growth. It's the first and only economic system in human history that is intrinsically expansionary. If it doesn't grow, it collapses into crisis, triggering recessions, and this of course causes a wide range of catastrophic social consequences. People lose their jobs, poverty goes up, inequality rises, and so on, right? So in order to stay afloat, capitalism has to grow at a rate of about 3% per year. And this might seem like a small increment on the face of it, because we're used to thinking of growth in linear terms. But remember, this is a compounding exponential function. So 3% per year means doubling the global GDP every 23 years. So in the course of a single human lifespan, that's multiplying the economy by a factor of something like 14. So that's 14 times more extraction, production, and consumption globally at the end of your lifetime than was happening at the beginning. Now, this might not be a problem if GDP was just plucked out of thin air, but it's not. It's very tightly coupled to material and energy use. So the more that we grow the economy, the more resources and energy the economy requires. And this is ultimately what's driving ecological breakdown. So I'm gonna take a second here just to show a couple of slides, which I think are quite useful. If I can just pull this up, give me 1 second. Right. So, this graph here gives us a sense of the relationship between GDP and resource use on a global level. The gray line here is global GDP in constant real terms. And the black line here is global material use. And we can see that while there was some relative decoupling in the 1990s, in the 21st century, there's been actually a kind of recoupling or rematerialization of the economy, with resource use rising at a rate that's actually faster than GDP, for reasons that we can discuss later on if you'd like. And this is driving global resource use to extremely dangerous levels. This graph here shows total global consumption of all materials, including metal, fossil fuels, construction materials, biomass like timber and fish, and so on. The red line that we see here is 50 billion tons, and that's what ecologists say is roughly a kind of sustainable threshold. We blew past that threshold in the late 1990s, and global resource use has just accelerated since then, and is now exceeding the threshold by close to 100%, right? Now, crucially, not everyone is responsible for this crisis in the same way, right? This is what happens when we break down global resource use by nations, by income group, right? So on the left here, we have low-income nations, which, as you can see, consume significantly under the per capita threshold, about 2 or 3 tons of stuff per person per year. So too with lower middle income countries. Upper middle income countries consume at roughly the sustainable threshold, right? High income countries, on the other hand, consume the region of 4 times over the safe threshold. So that's about 28 material tons of stuff per person per year, which is an extraordinarily high rate of metabolic throughput, okay? Now, this is interesting because if we were all to consume at the level of the average person in the rest of the world, then we would not be in a state of ecological breakdown right now, which is an extraordinary fact, okay? Overshoot is being driven almost exclusively by excess resource and energy use on an aggregate level in high income nations, right? Now, crucially, the impacts of this excess throughput in high income nations is actually offshored to the global south, because we know that roughly about 50% of the materials that the global north consumes are net appropriated from the global south, net extracted. And we can see this if you just look around you at the things that you buy and use. A significant proportion of that is extracted from the global south. And that's where we're seeing all of the ecological devastation taking place. You're not going to see it, in England or in Norway. You're going to see it in the Amazon basin. You're going to see it in Indonesia. You're going to see it in the cobalt mines of the Congo, in the lithium mines of Bolivia, and so on. Okay, and something similar is true also of CO2 emissions. We know that the global north is responsible for the vast majority of CO2 emissions in excess of the safe planetary boundary. The US alone is responsible for about 40%, the EU about 29%, and the global north as a group is responsible for about 92% of climate breakdown. So that's emissions in excess of the safe boundary of 350 parts per million, which we crossed in the 1990s. Meanwhile, the global south, which was responsible for a minority share of this problem, suffers over 90% of the costs of climate breakdown and about 98% of the deaths related to climate breakdown, right? So what's happening here is ultimately a process not only of extractivism, but also of atmospheric colonization, okay? So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here, move back. Need to be able to find myself. Just a moment. Right. So in other words, it's important to understand that capitalist growth, to the extent that it requires new frontiers from which to extract cheap nature, quickly becomes colonial in character. I think it's important that we keep that in view. So what do we do about this? Well, the existing plan is what we call green growth. And this is the notion that GDP can continue rising indefinitely while ecological impact falls. Economists have been promising green growth for nearly 5 decades now. This is not a new idea. And yet, as you can see from what I've just demonstrated, it's never happened. In 2012, during the Rio conference, the idea gained significant traction with major reports by the World Bank and the IMF and the OECD and so on. But of course, none of these reports, these claims about future green growth, had any empirical grounding to them. But fortunately, since then, over the past 8 or 9 years, a number of major studies have been published demonstrating that basically green growth is empirically unfeasible, right? And we can think about this in 2 ways. First, we can consider resource use. We know that all existing evidence is clear that absolute decoupling of GDP from resource use is not possible to achieve on a global scale, even with very high rates of efficiency improvement. Now, why is this? It's because in a growth-oriented system, gains in efficiency are used to expand the process of production so that total resource use continues to rise despite efficiency improvements. This is sometimes known as the rebound effect. We can also see this when it comes to emissions. Now, With emissions, we know that it's possible to absolutely decouple GDP from emissions simply by switching to renewable energy, right? And in fact, some high income nations have already started to accomplish this kind of decoupling. The question is, can we do this quickly enough to stay within the carbon budget for 1.5 or 2 degrees, okay? We're constrained by carbon budgets here. And the answer, unfortunately, is no. Why? Because more growth means more energy demands, and more energy demands makes it all the more difficult and probably impossible to achieve a sufficiently rapid transition to renewable energy, right? So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is itself clear that in the absence of speculative techno fixes, the only way to stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees is for high income nations to significantly reduce their resource and energy use. And this is where degrowth comes in. Degrowth is a planned reduction of aggregate resource and energy use to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way. So the question becomes for us, how do we get there? I just want to think about a couple of concrete steps before wrapping up. The first step is to abandon the notion that all sectors of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need them. This is an irrational and ecologically insane way to run an economy. Instead, we need to have an open conversation about what parts of the economy we actually want to expand, things like public healthcare, renewable energy, public transportation, and so on, and what parts are clearly too big and need to be scaled down. So things like arms, SUVs, private jet production, McMansions, industrial beef production, advertising, the practice of planned obsolescence, whereby our gadgets and our appliances are designed to break down after a short period of time so that we have to buy new ones, et cetera, et cetera. Effectively, parts of the economy that are organized not around human need, but rather around exchange value or profit accumulation. So, of course, the reason that we don't do this, we don't have this conversation, is because of the specter of unemployment. Indeed, the biggest single reason that we've all been persuaded to back the growth agenda is because we know that we need jobs in order to survive. And in an economy that's constantly beset by crises of unemployment, we need growth to create new jobs to mop up unemployed labor. But it doesn't have to be this way. As we scale down less necessary parts of the economy, we will require less labor. But we can shorten the working week and distribute necessary labor more fairly. We don't need more jobs, we need a fair distribution of necessary work. So the exciting thing about this, about shortening the working week, is that it's been shown to have remarkable positive impacts on a wide range of indicators, including health, mental well-being, life satisfaction, gender equality, and most importantly, probably reductions in CO2 emissions, right? If the USA, for instance, was to shorten average working hours to that of the average European country, it would cut CO2 emissions immediately by 20%, okay? Now, one way to facilitate this would be to introduce a public job guarantee. And we could do that with a living wage at, say, 30 hours a week, so at a shorter working week standard. And this would effectively ensure that everyone who wants to work can get a job doing socially useful things, i.e. things that are organized around use value, like public services, care, renewable energy, local food production, ecosystem regeneration, woodland restoration, whatever it might be. And this would be powerful not only for mobilizing the labor necessary for the transition, but also because it would take the question of unemployment off the table and liberate us, therefore, to have a conversation about scaling down destructive parts of the economy without having to worry about the specter of unemployment. And by setting the job guarantee wage at a living wage level, it would raise wages across the board, across the private sector, right? Everybody would have to effectively offer the same minimum standard to avoid losing workers to the public job guarantee. And this would effectively shift income from capital to labor. And this brings me to a key point, which is that we need to reduce inequality. And this is a core principle of degrowth economics. High-income nations don't actually need more income to meet people's needs. The problem isn't a deficit of income. The problem is that it's all captured at the top. So the richest 5% capture nearly half of global GDP. And that's wild to consider, right? That means about half of all the labor we render and the resources we extract and the CO2 that we emit is done in order to make rich people richer, okay? So inequality effectively generates an artificial scarcity of income in the economy that creates incredible pressures for continued growth. We feel we have to grow the economy to improve social outcomes. But the key principle here is that we can solve our social problems right now simply by sharing what we already have more fairly, rather than plundering the earth for more. So for example, take the United States, which has a GDP per capita of 60,000 US dollars, right? One of the richest countries in the world. But interestingly, dozens of countries, not a few, dozens of countries beat the USA in terms of all crucial social indicators with a fraction of the GDP, sometimes as little as 50 or even less percent, right? How do they do this? By distributing income more fairly and by investing in universal public goods, right? And this second point here is crucial. By expanding people's access to public goods, by say decommodifying healthcare, education, transportation, internet, energy, and even housing, we can ensure that people have access to the foundational resources that they need to live flourishing lives without needing high levels of private income in order to do so. So decommodification becomes key to degrowth policy. Now, when we propose these ideas, the principle here is that we can liberate ourselves from growth dependency and allow ourselves to scale down excess resource and energy use in a way that would enable us to achieve a rapid transition to renewables in a matter of years, not decades, and reverse ecological breakdown, while at the same time ending poverty and enabling flourishing lives for all. Okay. Now, I want to make clear the class politics that are at play here, right? The mainstream green movement has for too long, I think, focused primarily on individual behavior change, right? We need to fly less and recycle more and compost our food waste and so on. And of course, that's important. We must do those things. But there are two major problems with this approach. The first is that it fails to come to grips with the deep structural drivers of the crisis we face. And second, because there's no way that you can get working class people on board with this kind of vision, right? Degrowth does the opposite. Degrowth offers a direct critique of capitalism and proposes alternatives that are focused on social justice, not just a class politics within high-income nations, but also a politics that insists on solidarity with the communities in the global south that are being ravaged by extractivism and climate breakdown in order to support northern growth. So degrowth is, in addition to everything else, fundamentally a call for decolonization. Now, in the face of it, degrowth might seem like a hard sell, right? Some people worry about the framing of degrowth. Perhaps it sounds negative at first, and I get that. But this is only a problem because we have been so conditioned to believe that growth is good in the first place. So, ultimately, what is growth under capitalism? It's a process of enclosure, commodification, exploitation, and elite accumulation. So these processes, which are quite often destructive to human communities and certainly to ecosystems, have been repackaged and sold back to us as growth, in the language of growth. And this is a powerful framing because growth sounds so natural and so obviously good. Who would ever be against growth, right? And so we're therefore persuaded to buy into it and back policies that will deliver more of it when otherwise we might not. So growth is, in this sense, the ideology of capitalism. It persuades us to see our interests as aligned with the interests of capital, and therefore effectively prevents us from mounting any meaningful critique or resistance, okay? Now, what's powerful about degrowth is that it identifies this trick and rejects it. It confronts the ideology of capital head on, exposes growth for what it is, and calls for reversal of the damage that's been caused. If growth is a process of enclosure, commodification, and elite accumulation, then degrowth is the process of de-enclosure, decommodification, and disaccumulation. So this is not about building a smaller version of the same failed economy. It's about building a completely different kind of economy altogether, an economy that's focused on human well-being and ecological stability, an economy that's more abundant, more just, and more caring. So I'll leave it at that and pass on to Susan.
Great. Thank you, Matthew, for bringing us together in constructive dialogue, and Jason for your magnificently clear and concise communication of deep, complex understandings. So I'm grateful to all of you who have joined together virtually to learn and motivate each other to address a troubling paradox. Scientists and activists around the world call for reducing societal metabolism to curb harmful social environmental consequences of growth. Yet, the quantity of material and energy used by human economies continues to increase by the minute, while governments and businesses promise and prioritize further growth. Such a paradox raises questions about how we change course and what is constraining shifts towards healthier paths. Certainly, privileged actors exercise sophisticated means to sustain growth systems in which they enjoy disproportionately large benefits and bear few risks and burdens. However, even if Elon Musk flew the wealthiest 1% off to Mars, a drive for growth would still persist in many, though not all, places and persons, even some of those most exploited and degraded by growth economies. Our capacities to change course are constrained by particular modes of knowing and being that are intertwined with expanding colonial and capitalist and fossil fuel economies. As these worldviews and social systems that evolved historically with growth are empowered over others, those of us at the core find it difficult to imagine alternatives, while non-dominant groups struggle to sustain different lifeways. Efforts to transcend this paradox include thinking and acting to decolonize worldviews of expansionist myths and values, to encourage connections between science and activism, between North and South, to theorize change in ways that give everyone the courage to act, to recognize communities around the world who are regenerating long evolving paths and forging new ones. In dialogue with other post-development pathways, degrowth has gained strength in recent decades as a network of movements working to forge healthier futures for human and other natures by slowing down global use of material and energy, curbing cultural and personal obsession with growth, and reorienting values, institutions, and worldviews around equitable well-being. This journey is necessarily multidimensional and multi-sided. So our new book, The Case for Degrowth, considers everyday practices, relationships, design, myths and values, institutions, social systems, policies, movements. No one site or motor of change is privileged. Each of us can make positive moves on various fronts. Then via co-evolution, these moves interact in unpredictable and often mysterious ways. So what's the story of degrowth? Following a century of diversely positioned critiques of and resistance to social and ecological sacrifices of industrial expansion, this word, this idea of degrowth was launched into late 20th century politics and social movements. And following decades of some kind of arcane intellectual discussion centered mainly in Europe, it's also erupted in wider worldwide scholarly conversations, headlining now around 50 books and hundreds of articles in numerous languages. So a couple of the very different books that appeared this year, in addition to Jason's excellent book and the one we did, one is called Degrowth in Movement, in which Nina Treum, Matthias Schmelzer, and Karina Buckhart bring together 20 participatory case studies to explore a mosaic of grassroots experiences with degrowth. Sort of a very different approach is Exploring Degrowth, a Critical Guide, in which Vincent Leguay and Anitra Nelson examine deep intellectual roots, conceptualizations, debates over politics and applications of growth theory and practice. However, even as world conferences, graduate courses, publications continue to bring together enthusiastic activists and scholars, the term degrowth has found very little traction in mainstream public media and discourse. With Mathew Rose has already pointed out, that's not at all surprising. But this year, shockingly robust sales and zealous responses from really wide publics suggest that Jason's book and our book are riding a new wave of public interest. Some of the things that might be going on is that our world conditions changing, open possibilities to even ask new questions for many of us. Also, I think both of these books communicate messages relevant for people who are not economists or environmental scientists. They're not hippies living in vegan communes, right? Just other kinds of people. I also think both books go beyond ruthless critique to provide hope and generate plans for action. Jason locates current actors in a history of shifting modes of production, provoking people to question whether our era can or should be prolonged through green growth, and how we might look forward to future modes that foreground climate action, climate justice. Our book embraces care and commons in a theory of change that motivates and empowers everyday people to move towards healthier worlds every day. One thing that I think helped make our book more meaningful for a wide range of readers is the collaboration among we four co-authors, Yorgos Kallis, Giacomo D'Alisa, and Federico Da Maria. We all come from different countries and languages. Amongst us, we've studied economics, business, environmental science, chemistry, political ecology, anthropology, gender, race, etc. We have really different perspectives, which means you can guess we don't always see eye to eye, and we've learned from each other through all kinds of courses, conferences. A 2014 book we collaborated on called Degrowth, Vocabulary for a New Era. So in this new book, we consider policy packages that establish environments that nourish the emergence of different types of pathways. Jason beautifully introduced sort of a similar span of policies, right? Green New Deals without growth, reduced working hours, universal basic incomes and services that can interact with job guarantees, support for community economies and commons, and reorganization of public financing, banking, etc. So we're actually happily surprised to see that partly in response to activist demands in the face of COVID disasters, that some governments are starting to consider even implement aspects of these proposals. But even the best policies will not succeed without deep social and cultural change. And many of us find it difficult to even think about degrowth because we've been socialized in the cult of growth. Our bodies, our visceral reactions, our desires, our appetites are so deeply bound up with this world of growth. Any of you familiar with these myths? Larger GDPs correlate with greater happiness, longevity, physical and mental health, education, or lower infant mortality, obesity, addiction, incarceration, suicide, harms. Totally not true. How about this one? Growing economic pies lead to greater equality. Not often. New technology is halting environmental destruction that to date has gone hand in hand with economic growth. As Jason points out, no evidence for that one. My personal favorite, Homo economicus is a natural, greedy, individualistic species due to selfish gene that drives maximization of personal gain. So hundreds of scholarly publications have used empirical data and analytical tools to try to debunk these myths of growth. Both of our books present the gist of these findings, but I think in this world, we're all facing a dilemma of understanding how is it that facts are often not very strong against feelings and beliefs and passions that are so deeply embedded. Jason and I both work in anthropology, where our colleagues study across cultures through history, deep through archaeology, to show that this competitive individualism and constantly expanding production and consumption that increasingly shape lifeways in recent centuries are extremely unusual in the hundreds and thousands of years of human cultural life. Frankly, we would not still exist as a species if we'd been behaving that way through much time. And actually, we may not be around much longer on the way we're going. Instead, during millennia, a rainbow of kinship, gender, ethnic, religious systems have operated with the express purpose of sustaining and regenerating human and other resources. Only in recent centuries, these systems were co-opted into facilitating expanding exploitation of human and other resources for profit. Some of the key mechanisms are racialization of certain human groups as inferior, which justifies the appropriation of their labor and resources. Pushing the heteronormative nuclear family as a unit of production and reproduction, and gender systems that extol market production as a sign of superior masculinity, bribing men into selling their own labor, and that relegate care and reproduction as inferior feminine realm activities, right? So I'm particularly interested in intersections of these social systems, such as subordinate masculinities that condition millions of low-income and non-white men to sell their labor in grueling and dangerous work that degrades their bodies and their environments. Assimilationist and liberal feminist effort to empower non-white people and women by moving them into this powerful productivist role have certainly involved enlarged economies, but they've not brought about the kind of caring, equitable worlds that we're seeking. So how can we rethink our social systems to build towards the regeneration of life rather than the generation of market value? Options include learning from communities and experiences around the world and through history that embrace and exercise principles that seem to have been long at the core of human culture: care and regeneration of common goods. What are the primary commons? Healthy human communities, cultures, natural environments. That's the resources that we need to invest in. All right, the challenging thing about degrowth is that many of us work it in a world that we call pluriverse. The magic of degrowth lies in its ability to energize and connect remarkably heterodox thinking and heterogeneous action, including that of many non-dominant groups and differently positioned actors. Degrowth ambitions do not aim to consolidate one orthodox scientific theory or one unified political platform. We don't want to replace neoliberal capitalism with a different universal model. Instead, we're seeking to figure out policies, practices, common senses that actually create possibilities for a rainbow of old and new modes to thrive and coexist together, right? With this theory that diversity is really key to resilience over time, the same way in biodiversity, also in diversity of social cultural systems. My own horizons of possibility and alliance have been nourished during 30 years of intermittent living and learning with low impact communities in the Andes and the Amazon. I've written about synergies with these movements, or with movements around Buen Vivir, Zapatismo, agroecology, in publications like Pluriversal Learning, Pathways Toward a World of Many Worlds. If some of you viewers ask, how can such groovy rainbow alliances make any real impact? How can we make a political effectiveness? I'll be happy to hear your ideas and to share some hopeful perspectives. Thank you.
All right, let's just go over to the questions now. I think you can see them as well. I'm hoping. All right, let's start with the first one from Katrin, Katrin R. To both panelists, the impossibility of reconciling perpetuate economic growth and staying within the planetary boundaries is very obvious. How do you think we get there? How could people lie to themselves like that? What can we learn from how we got here and how we get out of it?
Well, it's a very good question, Catherine. Thank you. I think this sort of relates to the point that I tried to raise in my intervention, which is basically that the reason we've accepted this discourse is because of the framing of it. It's a very powerful and compelling framing. I mean, you can sell virtually anything that's, no matter how destructive it is, you can manage to sell it to people if you frame it in the language of growth, right? So whoever came up with the idea of repackaging, what are otherwise quite often exploitative and destructive processes in the language of growth, I mean, it's the most powerful ideology I think that that we've ever encountered, really, and it's certainly the most hegemonic in the sense of, if you consider the left and the right of our political spectrum, they bicker about virtually everything, but when it comes to the question of growth, they're absolutely united. Right? There's no daylight between them. It's impossible to even question, right? So they may bicker about, how to distribute the yields of growth and what might make growth happen more quickly, right? But on the question of growth itself, there's no debate, and so you really see how even our political spectrum is kind of locked down under this hegemony, and there's virtually no room for critical thought on this question. So in that sense, it's kind of not, it's not surprising. Like when I encounter people who are immediately resistant to the concept of degrowth, I totally understand. I mean, when I was I was there. When it was first mentioned to me, I was like, you must be crazy. We obviously need growth. It's so essential to, well-being and to a stable economy and so on. And, it struck me that I'd never actually thought about this question. I just kept repeating things that I've been told, things that I learned in economics, things that I learned in graduate school and so on, and never stopped to think about them myself. And I'm an academic. My job is to be critical about knowledge. And I'd never asked this question. And so, when I first encountered the word, I rejected it immediately. But then it also immediately kind of caused this process of conversion almost, right? Like it forced me to question some of my deepest assumptions. It sent me into, years of introspection and research. And I emerged as a defender of the concept because I feel like the empirical basis behind it is so robust. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see the way that, ultimately what we're dealing with here is, hegemonic ideology, and what's required in response to it is a kind of counterattack. And I think degrowth offers that counterattack, which is very refreshing, I think, at a time when, the horizons of our imagination are so constrained.
Susan.
Well, I think Jason did a nice job there. I'm going to actually jump to another question that I love. Someone writes in, how many hours a week do you work currently? This is the time for confession. I actually grew up following many generations of very modest rural people in Minnesota. Large family, not much income. I lived in frugality and then spent much of my adult life living in 15 years living in South America amongst very low impact, low income people. So my personal life, I just learned how to live with very low consumption, which was a shock when I moved to the United States and really didn't fit in. So that part, it's okay with me. Considering controlling consumption is not difficult. Controlling productivism is really hard in my life. I feel so much the push that to be a good citizen, a good daughter, a good contributor, admired human, that I should be working and producing not just 40 hours a week, but more. And that what we produce is the measure of our value. That's deep inside me, from my religion, from every movie I've ever watched, from advertising, and I really struggle with that, right? So consumption's not so hard for me, but touche to the person who asked us, how are we doing in reducing our own work hours?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I'd also like to jump in on that one, actually, because I kind of feel like in my job, in my life, I have two kinds of work. I have the work that I sort of have to do, and then I've got the work that I really want to do, right? And I work in public education, of course, and as the sector in the UK has been squeezed by neoliberal austerity measures, our workloads have really increased, right? And what that means is that we have a lot of bureaucratic responsibilities, et cetera, much more than we would have had a number of years ago. And so I find that if I'm also longing for a world where we have more staff in the university, for example, so that we can share those workloads, more fairly, and free us up to do things that are more important and meaningful to us, like actually engaging with students and working on our own research and writing and doing things that are not those as well, spending time with our families and caring for our relatives and getting to know our neighbors, which is impossible right now in a situation where we have just so much to do. And so, yeah, it ends up being quite alienating, but I'm totally on Susan's page with the need to question our own productivist ethics. I mean, that is deep-seated and that has to be challenged. I want to jump into a question here that is about, from somebody anonymous. They say, how would you say degrowth is related to or different from socialism and communism? I'd like to speak to this really briefly. So first of all, I'll say that I think that degrowth poses a challenge to this easy dichotomy, this kind of 20th century dichotomy between capitalism and socialism, in the way that it was manifest primarily during the 20th century, right? So the USSR, the Soviet Union here, is not the alternative we're talking about for a wide range of reasons. One of those is that the Soviet Union was a devotedly growthist regime, right? Like it actively sought to compete with the USA and other Western countries to expand its production and consumption and so on, right? So in some ways it was sort of basically, it was growth obsessed. It was effectively, capitalism run by the state, really, with really disastrous ecological and social destruction and human exploitation. So to me, that doesn't offer, a meaningful solution. I think degrowth is interesting because it calls us to question the underpinnings of both of those regimes, of both of these models, and imagine something different for the 21st century. Imagine something that's fundamentally new, that brings our economy, into balance with the living world and is sort of compatible with survival in the Anthropocene, right? To me, that's an exciting project that's a matter of, imagination and innovation rather than, dusty old 20th century models. Now, that being said, I will say that there's quite a lot of alignment between degrowth scholars and eco-socialism. And that's interesting to point out. That being said, there are some branches of eco-socialism that are also growthist. They just believe that basically under an eco-socialist regime, you can have growth that is lower impact, right? But I think that what degrowth offers is a critique of some of the assumptions that are embedded therein, and a kind of challenge to eco-socialist thought. And so I see degrowth as kind of as situated within eco-socialist traditions, but also challenging some of their assumptions. And ultimately also, just to close on this one, is to say that, is to reiterate what Susan was saying, which is that degrowth is not about a kind of single story, right, of a single solution. It's really a matter of sort of pulling back and creating space for alternative visions, for a pluriverse to flourish. And to me, that's also what distinguishes it from some of the more dogmatic versions of socialism that we've seen in the past. So I see lots of synergies, but also some challenges that are worth thinking about.
Yeah, I would just like to add to your really thoughtful answer there. Jason mentioned earlier that colonial capitalism and sort of growth processes began to sort of coalesce and emerge around 500 years ago. A bunch of institutions, social systems, values grew sort of century after century. And in the 20th century, people tried to react against the damages and problems caused by some of those by shaping modes of socialist and communist reaction. And I think many of the initiatives were quite admirable in the terms of trying to return to sort of inclusive communal thought and social action. But remember, they were trying to make those shifts in a deep hundreds of years of colonial capitalist hierarchical systems. And that's a really, really tough change to make. And I think we have a lot to learn from the 20th century struggles against those problems as we try in the 21st century to try to also do that. And then we're going to add in, is it okay, Matthew, that we're just leaping in on these questions?
Just
okay. Someone asked, can you give a practical example of what degrowth might look? And I would like to share one example that I've been involved with and learning with. It's about our households. In the United States, the most common type of household is actually one-person households. 27% of us live like that in the last census. In Europe, some of your countries, up to 40% of the people live in one-person households. That's great for the economy. It's really bad for material and energy because every single household has its own refrigerator, its own stove, its own computers, its own televisions, washing machines, whatever, right? So you can see it's very good for the economy. There's movements in different forms and countries. Obviously, people have been experimenting with communes and all different kind of things. I've been working with some people in San Francisco who are living in co-living, you know, maybe 10, 20, sometimes 30 to 40 people that live in big old mansions sometimes, that each have a personal room, but they have shared spaces to gather, to host events, to host each other, and also shared provisioning. Instead of each person driving his car to the grocery store and buying all kinds of stuff in little plastic packages, they just get bulk provisioning and maybe take turns cooking together in bulk. So the one change is that it's a drastic savings in material and energy used in our daily life. What's important to me is that's inseparable from social and emotional and relationship changes, right? Because when I live alone, if I lived alone, you know, I don't even need to debate with to do commons with anyone, even about making breakfast, right? I don't even have coffee with anyone. I just do everything by myself, and I don't learn how to common, how to live in common, how to celebrate the challenges and joys of convivial sharing day to day, right? Much of my life might be commodified if I lived alone. And so imagine, I actually don't live alone, but if I live alone and I didn't ever exercise commons, and then I went to the global climate agreement in Paris, and I'm trying to negotiate how the entire world is going to share our commons of the atmosphere, I'm not very well prepared, right? I mean, my feelings, my desires, they're so selfish because I live alone. And I think these groups of people that are figuring out how to live together, not only do they make a real reduction in material and energy use every day, that's very significant when we look at the whole population, but also they learn to think and struggle and care about common resources and common spaces, which I think is probably the muscle that's going to be most important for us in planning the future. So there's one very practical example of one of million degrowth initiatives going on around this world.
I see there's a question about the global south that's addressed to me, so I'm gonna tackle that one. So degrowth in the global south. So you know, what do we make of that? I should say that the usual line that you'll hear from degrowthers, or from rather ecological economists who promote degrowth, who study degrowth, is that degrowth is for the global north, right? So we would expect that, in fact, in most of the global south, people do not use enough resources and energy to meet basic needs. Okay, I mean, like on an economy-wide level. And so, you know, additional resource and energy use is required for human development, we might say, okay? Now, a lot of people in the global south will actually challenge that view. And they'll say, that might be an easy sell for you, right, in your debates in the global north, but there's actually lots of global south countries that do have problems with growthism, right? So Arturo Escobar recently, in a conversation with Susan, pointed out that, like, and he's from Latin America, he pointed out, like, look, you know, this is actually a problem on our continent as well. We have governments that are fully organized around extractivism, with extraordinarily destructive consequences for human communities and ecology. And so please, like, give us also a shot at a conversation about liberating ourselves from the growth imperative. And I think that's quite important to acknowledge. And I think it's worth pointing out, you know, the history of growthism in the global south is actually relatively recent. It's an artifact of colonialism ultimately, right? Like, during the colonial period, economies were you know, subsistence economies and even domestic industrial economies were totally destroyed and remade in the interests of you know, extraction, production, and export for growth, right? Primarily for the benefit of the global north. In the wake of decolonization, something miraculous happens, actually. Newly independent countries in many parts of the global south elected progressive governments that rejected the growthism of the colonial era and sought to build alternatives that were organized around human well-being, and in some cases explicitly around ecological stability as well. And we can see this in the writings of everyone from Frantz Fanon to Aimé Césaire to Mahatma Gandhi to Thomas Sankara. like many of the key progressive leaders of the global South in the immediate post-colonial decades, were resolutely what today we would call post-growth, right? They wanted to organize the economy around use value rather than around exchange value, and specifically in order to de-link from the extractivist pressures of the global North, okay? So part of decolonization meant thinking about producing for our own needs with our own resources, with our own labor, and being as self-sufficient as possible, right? And this was a remarkably successful movement. But the problem was that it cut off the global North's access to the cheap labor and raw materials they'd enjoyed under colonialism. And so Western powers reacted against this movement very violently, in some cases toppling progressive leaders in violent coups, installing dictators in their place who would then re-govern the global economy in the interests of Western powers, but ultimately through the process of structural adjustment. Structural adjustment programs imposed by the World Bank and the IMF during the 80s and 90s reversed all of those progressive gains that the global South had made, destroyed that alternative vision for global South economies, and effectively forced them to pay obeisance to the imperative of growth, right? So global South economies were fundamentally reorganized around growth imperatives, even to the point where the one tool that they needed to build flourishing societies, which is the ability to expand fiscal deficits by relying on the national currency, was effectively disallowed. In order to get income, they had to sabotage their own environments and exploit their own labor for the sake of export to the North, right? And that is still the conundrum that global South countries face today. If they want to pay for public services, if they want to create jobs, they have only one option, which is foreign direct investments. And to get foreign direct investment, you have to deregulate labor, deregulate the environment, give tax breaks to corporations, et cetera, right? All of this mitigates heavily against the kind of human-centered economics that is actually required, okay? So I think that we need to, as we think about alternatives, we don't have to invent this from scratch. We can reach back into the post-colonial movements, the anti-colonial movement, and draw significant inspiration. And to me, that's very inspiring.
Yeah, I just want to add one little bit. Having spent much of my life living in the global South, there's really different voices too. Politicians, some middle-class people, leaders in responsibilities, are desperately negotiating for concessions, for oil, mining, et cetera, to get cash to try to look after their countries. That's true. There's also all kinds of people doing environmental justice movements where they're fighting against those concessions. They're saying, I do not want the mine, that dam, that agribusiness to penetrate my territory, my body, my culture. Get it out, right? And so there's really, like in any society, there's really different positions. And to complicate it, the second half of the 20th century in Latin America was characterized by development industry going in with the job of trying to convince people to want more money and to create more money, right? To move away from regenerating their communities and to selling their labor and produce as individuals for cash. So there's these historical forces that interact. And I think the best thing we can do is listen. I mean, people will often say to me, oh, well, the global South doesn't want degrowth. They want more stuff like we do, right? I say, let's listen to them. There's different voices, different movements. And yeah, we need to learn on that front. So go back to Jason, see what you have to say here.
I totally agree. That's very beautifully put, Susan. Somebody's asked, what is the biggest mistake that the environmentalist movement has made in the 21st century? And that's an interesting question. The way I want to answer this is to talk about the Green New Deal, which I'm a huge fan of. I'm a big proponent of the Green New Deal. But one of the problems with the way that the Green New Deal debate has played out is this, is that the opponents of the Green New Deal on the right will say, the problem with the measures you're proposing is that they're going to constrain GDP growth, right? And so the reason that we have, and they've won the argument in the sense of the reason that we have not taken the kind of radical measures that we need for a progressive Green New Deal is precisely because that's likely to constrain profit margins and growth, right? So the left has come back and said, no, a Green New Deal is going to be good for growth, okay? And this is the primary way that the left has tried to sell the Green New Deal, by saying, you know, look at all these models, we can prove that the Green New Deal is going to be great for growth. And the way I see it is that this is a problem on a number of levels. First of all, even if you do, create some sort of massive government stimulus that accomplishes a Green New Deal while growing the economy, this is going to be a problem. Like, even if it does lead to growth, which it very well could, okay, this is going to be a problem because the more you grow the economy, the more energy you use, as I was explaining before. And the more energy you use, the more difficult it is to achieve a rapid transition to renewables, okay? So in effect, if you have a Green New Deal with growth, you sabotage your chances at succeeding in the Green New Deal. And furthermore, we have to remember that climate change, as I tried to point out earlier, is not the only crisis we face. So even if we imagine the energy problem away, you still have a Green New Deal that's effectively growing resource use, okay? And there's nothing green about that. So once you bring the question of resource use and other planetary boundaries into the picture, then again, like the idea of a Green New Deal focused on growth is a total disaster. Now the problem here is that, is furthermore that, like, as long as we play into the growth narrative, we put ourselves on the back foot, right? Because capital will almost always win on that territory. Like they can justify doing all sorts of things in the name of growth, cutting labor regulations, cutting environmental regulations, et cetera, et cetera. So once we're in that terrain, then our task is much more difficult than it needs to be. If we reject the growth narrative from the start and say, look, it doesn't matter if the G&D creates growth or not, right? GDP has no relationship to the things we want to achieve. It's not necessary for improving human well-being. It's not necessary for the kind of innovation we need for renewable energy and so on, right? We can have a Green New Deal without growth and achieve all of our goals. And that immediately takes you out of this never-ending battle about whether a G&D is going to create growth or not, and allows you to focus on what you actually want to achieve. So to me, the growth framing of the Green New Deal is a problem, and we should reject it and call for something more ecologically coherent, more technologically feasible, and more socially just.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on the Green New Deal. Many of us were involved with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I thought were wonderful. My favorite goal is greater equity, but I also love life on Earth, life below the water, climate health, etc. And then there's this weird, right in the middle, Sustainable Development Goal number 8, which is called sustained economic growth. And I'm like, okay, wait, how can that work with all these others? And I see now in the Green New Deal, Jason described really nicely, in the US, in other countries are struggling with that. I'll just read 2 of the pillars of the European Green New Deal, which I really like. Well, I like the second one. One of them is similar to the US. Pillar number 5 in the European Green New Deal says raising the standard of living. The Green New Deal for Europe lifts all communities toward greater prosperity, security, and liberty. Okay, thank goodness they didn't say more cash, right? But they suggest it. Pillar 8, ending the dogma of endless growth. We must abandon GDP growth as the primary measure of progress, instead focus on what matters: health, happiness, and environment. So I think, right, we can critique these tensions, but actually I think these tensions are really fruitful, that we lay out all of our goals, the sustainable development, the Green New Deal goals, and look at these kind of contradictions and tensions among them, right? Can we really get more equity if we're forcing more growth? Can we really help the climate if we're forcing more growth? And then sort of struggle through the coexistence and the prioritization of these different goals for our own societies. Back to you, Jason. Pick a topic.
Okay, cool, yeah. So the, just to clarify for people who don't know, in Europe, there are 2 things that sound really similar. There's the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, which, as Mathew mentioned, is a disaster. And then there's the Green New Deal for Europe, which Susan mentions, which is promoted by DiEM25, which is Yanis Varoufakis' political party in the EU Parliament, and it's excellent. It's in fact, I think, the first ever Green New Deal that explicitly challenges the growth imperative. So it's a Green New Deal without growth, which is great and should be the model for the Green New Deals that we built. I should mention also that Naomi Klein and Asad Rehman are presently collaborating towards bringing a whole spectrum of different people together around a framework for a global Green New Deal that would similarly challenge growth dependency. So that's interesting to think about. So this idea is taking off, I think, in interesting ways. I want to answer the question that somebody asked here. Megan asks, policy rarely changes all at once. What are some incremental steps that governments can take to move towards degrowth? Which actually resonates with another question I saw earlier, but I'm going to answer it this way. So I think that, and this is me gambling a little bit, and maybe Susan has a different idea, but if I was to stake my money on a single policy, like the single most important policy, it would be a public job guarantee, right? Now, on the face of it, that might not seem super ecological, but as I tried to explain in my talk, and the reason I wanted to bring it in was because I think that once you have the public job guarantee on the table, the conversation will utterly change, the culture will change, right? Once people see they have the opportunity to do work that is that's organized around use value rather than around exchange value, like why would you want to flip burgers for McDonald's to, you know, enhance the corporate profits of that mega institution with no meaning or benefit to yourself besides the minimum wage, when you could be restoring a woodlands or caring for elderly people in your neighborhood, or, you know, or running a local soccer club, or anything else that a community might decide is worth doing with a public job guarantee, right? That's powerful. But also, as soon as you have the question of unemployment off the table, we can have an open conversation about what parts of the economy we can scale down, you know, without worrying about the fear of unemployment. And I really think that this is the kind of thing that would kind of crack open the conversation, cut the Gordian knot, and allow us to think more ecologically. What's exciting about the public job guarantee, and the reason that I promote it, is because it's very easy to fund. One ecological economist has estimated that for the USA, it could be funded with only 1% of GDP, so marginal, right? And furthermore, it's extremely popular. In the USA and in virtually every European country, it polls at like 70 to 75%, right? People want a public job guarantee. And so this is the kind of thing that you can imagine a political party passing as a first step towards opening a broader conversation about shifting to an economy organized around use value rather than exchange value. And I think it would really help the conversation.
Great. Yes, I'm a huge fan of our own history in the United States. We had an experience like that after the terrible Depression with public work projects that not only included forest management, building parks, doing civil service, but also arts, recording oral histories, photography, painting, wonderful, rich efforts that enrich the life of the whole nation through that. You know, a society that's saying, look, what will be good for us? Let's fund it and let's train and support people to do that. I love that project. I also totally agree with Jason that it seems like a small thing, but it would shift us away from the jobs versus environment debate, which is so ugly and makes these men I study, they say like miners, loggers, they work in these terrible, painful, risky jobs that hurt the environment, but they want to defend those jobs because they need the cash, right? And so if they had an option like a healthy guaranteed option to choose, they may not feel that antagonism where they need to fight against environmental protections because they're a miner or a logger. Also, nowadays in the US, this terrible debate of health versus economy, which is more important, the health versus, you know, should we let people die so we can have growth? I also think I would consider finding ways for the job guarantee to work together with universal basic income. And the way I see it is that we can take the wealth of our nations. Actually, we have Udall and Grassley are two senators from both sides of the aisle in the US, just proposed increasing the rents and the percentages on oil subsidy or stops on oil leases from federal land by 50%. They're like, why are we subsidizing oil profits? We could take this income and help the nation, right? Like Alaska, there's a shared dividend of the resources. Norway, a shared dividend of the resources. So we could use our resources and say, look, our shared territory produces value in the market. We can take that value and invest it in the human resources by giving everyone just enough to eat and live and rent a home, right? And the reason I think that's important is because it distinguishes this idea that people with disability, on welfare, on unemployment, mothers with little babies that can't work are somehow losers because they're not working, right? They're leeches, they're bad. And they've got all these labels for these different programs, right? And if we say every single citizen gets just a basic survival salary because we want to invest in the regeneration and well-being of our most important resource, which are human beings, then I think emotionally and socially it could help to overcome that kind of ranking and discrediting where we sort of blame and marginalize the welfare mom or the person that's faking he has disability. He's not really manic depressive, he's just too lazy to work, and allow people for whatever reason who can't or don't want to sell their labor to choose a quiet life where they're not hurting people and they're not ruining the environment and just living modestly and quietly by themselves. I would also like to include that in together with the wonderful job guarantee options.
Okay, I see a question about degrowth in one country, which kind of reminds me of the old socialism in one country question. But I think it's an important one, so I'll try to address it. So yes, of course, like, you know, in terms of the ecological imperative here, it's quite clear that in order for us to stay under 1.5 or even 2 degrees, you know, virtually all high income nations will have to scale down their throughput. Okay, so that's clear. So, you know, if one country adopts a kind of degrowth route, this obviously in and of itself will not solve the problem. But it's nonetheless powerful, and we should push for it for a few reasons. First of all, it can provide a really powerful example. And one of the examples I have of how powerful this can be is thinking back to, I guess was it last year when Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, announced, apparently out of the blue, at least we had no prior warning, that she was going to remove GDP growth as an objective for New Zealand's budget. And that news ricocheted around the world. I mean, it went viral so fast. And just watching it on social media, I realized like people are deeply inspired by this. I mean, virtually every news outlet wanted to cover this story. Like, what does an economy look like without pursuing GDP growth, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we don't know how she's going to approach this. Maybe we'll agree, maybe we'll disagree. I'm leaving that open. But what's clear is that people are ready for an alternative, are eager to see something like that. And when it happens in one country, it can be extremely inspiring to social movements that are pushing for this kind of thing in other countries. That's one thing. The second thing is that it's possible for us to start creating alliances at the national level or even at the regional or city level. And this kind of thing is already happening. There's an organization called the Wellbeing Economies Alliance, which I urge you to look up. I believe it's based in Scotland. And what they're trying to do is get different regions or city governments and even national governments on board with well-being economics principles as a way of creating kind of an alternative, if you will, to the G8. So it'd be called the we all economies instead of the G8 economies. And that's to me very interesting. It's a way of opening conversations across national borders. It's a way of sharing ideas. It's a way of building momentum. Okay, so to me that's a promising approach. So yeah, there was a third point I wanted to add, and yet I can't remember it. I'm getting to be too old, so I'll pass it back to Susan.
That's all right, Jason. So Jason showed some amazing bar graphs in the beginning that the wealthiest countries consume so much more tons of material and energy than the medium and the poor income ones, right? That's pretty clear. We weighed that. Ms. Grant asked us, what about the differences within countries, right? There's wealthy people in the global south that are massively consuming and poor people in the global south. And in the north, there's also poor people versus wealthy, right? So we've got these like national levels, but they kind of hide, and thank you, Ms. Grant, for bringing that to our attention. They hide these real differences in consumption patterns and in contribution to emissions, to waste, etc. Those are really important to consider. This person ends by asking, do you agree that low incomes need higher income as green choices are more expensive than non-green choices? There's different opinions on that. I actually really disagree with that. I think if you want to buy the Impossible Burger, a fake pretend meat burger, it costs more than your regular McDonald's hamburger. I don't think the answer is to give people more cash so they can buy the Impossible Burger, which, by the way, it's not so sustainable. My favorite food is rice and beans. It's 10 times cheaper than either of those burgers. It's really low impact on the environment. It's delicious. You can make a big pot and share it with your friends and share together, right? So there's different ways to rethink things. And just go back to the example we already discussed a little bit about co-living, right? If someone, instead of saying, oh, that person is buying McDonald's and disposable stuff because they live alone and they're poor, they need more money so they can buy whatever organic green stuff. How about if we have policies and programs that support people to develop co-housing so that that person can live together with others in a larger space where they source organic food together cheaply from mass distributors and share wholesome sort of food. You see how there's different ways around. So just getting cash to poor people so they can buy stuff that's more organic or less harmful, I think that's a shortcut. And I think that there's other changes that are sort of more nourishing of healthy life worlds than that, to open possibilities. Back to Jason.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And then also just to say, like when you think about what takes up sort of the majority of like the consumption needs that we have, right? Like quite often this is us trying to access, you know, basic resources like, again, housing, transportation, healthcare, education, food, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what's interesting is that we know that decommodified versions of these foundational resources, these foundational goods in the economy, are much less ecologically intensive than commodified versions of them. Okay, so you know, transportation is sort of the obvious glaring one, right? Like it's much more energy intensive and materially intensive and expensive to own and operate your own private vehicle on highways, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, think of the materials involved in this than it is to have, you know, universal public transportation, right? Like public transportation is much more efficient and much more cost effective than private transportation. The same is true of healthcare, right? Like take the US health system. The USA spends more than $10,000 per person on its privatized healthcare system with disastrous health outcomes. Compare that to Spain, which spends nearly 80% less than the USA and has better health outcomes across the board, including a life expectancy that's 5 years longer, right? And so, and because Spain's healthcare system is 80% less cost intensive, it's also 80% less materially and energy intensive, right? Like it's much less impactful with much greater benefits. And so when it comes to this question of like, how will we be able to afford green stuff? I think the key thing here is that, you know, to the extent that we can decommodify the key resources we need to live flourishing lives, these things are significantly less impactful than private forms of consumption in those sectors, and that's important. Another thing to realize is that, like, you know, under capitalism, we have these kind of extreme monopolies, right? Where it's not just about you know, one company being very powerful, but also about only one kind of product being available, in the sense of if you want to buy a phone, then you have a choice between, you know, Apple and Samsung, et cetera, et cetera. But you don't have a choice as to how long that phone is going to last, right? Like basically it's going to collapse after 2 or 3 years, and you have to keep buying new ones all the time. Why? Because all of these companies are producing phones that are designed to break down after a short period of time. We can counter that with laws related to, you know, extended lifetime warranties, rights to repair, things like that, so that we can buy goods that are designed to last much longer and can be easily repairable. And therefore, we're able to access the goods that we need to use, like iPhones, like, you know, mobile phones, with significantly less material and energy consumption, and a lot less labor involved in producing those things too, right? So it cuts out a lot of that excess waste in the economy without any constraint on your ability to access the things you actually need. I want to answer a question that Guido asked here. Is a transition towards degrowth possible without causing a major crash of the global financial system? I like this question. And yeah, yes and no. So one of the major drivers of the growth imperative is that our economies are heavily laden with debt, right? And if you don't grow the economy, then you have difficulty paying debts down, and you don't pay debts down, then you have a financial crisis. So like the constant kind of debt cycles in our economy are major drivers of financial crisis. And you can imagine that in a degrowth scenario, you would have, you would trigger financial crises as a result. Now, many of the policies that we proposed here would effectively mitigate against that in terms of the human consequences. But one we haven't discussed so far, but which is core to a lot of ecological economics modeling, is debt cancellation, okay? So, and this has been worked out pretty extensively. I mean, look at like at the US presidential candidate, the former US presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders, had a very detailed plan for canceling student debt in the USA to the tune of more than $1 trillion US, right? In the UK, academics have worked out an extensive plan for the possibility of canceling not just student debt, but also excess household debt, mortgage debts, credit card debts, et cetera, et cetera. When you cancel debts like this, you relieve a lot of pressure for growthism and make your economy much more stable. Okay, so it's much less vulnerable to these perpetual financial crises. Now, of course, private creditors will lose out. But we might decide that's okay, right? We can have a conversation about what kinds of debts should be repaid and what kinds of debts just shouldn't have been debts in the first place, like student debts, and shouldn't be repaid, right? In fact, debts are just fictions. They're literally just made up. And, if, as David Graeber used to say, if democracy is going to mean anything, it must be at least the ability to dispense with fictions that no longer serve us, right? And so we should be able to have a conversation about canceling debts that are ruinous for us. And I think that that degrowth opens up possibilities for having that conversation, which is really important.
Jason, I'm thankful for you for mentioning David, who's present in our conversations. David was actually my graduate school classmate. We were born in the same week and we came of age together, and Jason's colleague. So he's present in when we think about debt and many other of these issues. I would like to respond to one wonderful question about alliances. How is it going connecting alliances, especially across the global South? That's a super vital question. There's no doubt that transformative responses will require mutually nourishing alliances among really diverse people. And I think that people that could have interest here include, forest dwellers, nature lovers, care providers, families with children, union members, biking fanatics, vegans, overworked professionals, hippies, indigenous territories, unemployed people, indebted people, student debt, climate refugees, back to landers. There's just so many different people who I think could ally in the interest of moving to a more gentle, healthier life ways and relationships. It's really hard to imagine how we can come together because political narratives and media are so divisive that it seems like we need to compete with each other and insult each other, right? I think there's really interesting ideas emerging. I think many of us in degrowth, we acknowledge that degrowth is not going to be this like big banner that joins together others in mobilizations, massive mobilizations, right? So we have to think of different metaphors for political organizing and alliances. And Padini Nirmal and Diane Rocheleau talk about roots and rhizomes, these kind of networks of connection that are actually both ends and means to many activist efforts amongst marginalized people, indigenous people. So it's basically like, if you imagine there's some plants like bamboo, poison ivy, their roots grow underground, sort of horizontally, they connect with each other, they give each other nourishment, and then they can pop up, like in response to rain or opportunities, they can pop up and grow new plants. And so I sort of think that's how degrowth visions, ideas, and actions are already working. They're already being harbored and circulated through subterranean networks of relationships. They may not be labeled with that word degrowth, but there's all kinds of related common senses that are there. They interconnect and nourish sort of cultural initiatives, civic movements. And I hope that as these roots, these networks of connections and mutual nourishing develops, it will allow responses to moments of opportunity, like COVID, where the world is turned upside down. All kinds of collaborative initiatives and caring emerged in new ways. People came together in really unprecedented ways, partly because they'd already been thinking and connecting in these quiet ways, maybe practicing common senses of sharing. The key thing for me is that this type of mobilization is really hard to eradicate. If I have a protest, if I take the government, you know, people are going to attack me. There's going to be backlash. There's going to be setbacks. There doubtless is with degrowth, right? But pieces of the rhizome, that network, in this case, degrowth, common senses, practices, relationships of caring and sharing and communality, they're left behind in the soil. Even when one initiative gets attacked, gets annihilated, that soil is still rich, and then they can grow and emerge in new manifestations, right? So that's the kind of way some of us have started to think about alliances across really different cultural, political, and power positions, and how we can start building in quiet nodes of mutual nourishment and connection for possibilities that we can't foresee yet in the future.
So I'll address this question, I think, from somebody asked a question about circular economies. Max, I think, how do degrowth objectives like the EU, how do growth objectives like the EU's hinder circular economic objectives? So this is a good question. So the idea of a circular economy has been gaining a lot of steam recently. In fact, it's even in, I believe, even in the European Green Deal proposal, right? And this is really important. You know, circular economy ideas are vital, and we absolutely must make our economies more circular. The problem is that growthism mitigates against circularity, right? For a number of reasons. One is that in order to grow, and this should be just obvious to anyone who's thought about it, but in order to grow the economy, you know, you need virgin extraction, right? Like you have to have some materials that are taken from outside the economy in order to expand it, right? You can't expand the economy while being circular at the same time. Not possible. And so this is a problem. Another thing to consider here is the fact that, you know, circularity is great, but the thing about circularity is that it effectively internalizes the costs of production, okay? And that is in tension with capitalism. Capitalism requires externalizing costs. It always needs an outside that it can mistreat, be it, you know, humans that it can degrade and exploit, or nature that it can take for free, effectively, such as atmospheric commons.
Or future generations that it can leave with our ecological debt.
Exactly. Yeah. Atmospheric commons, you know, forests in the global south, whatever it might be, there's always an external to capital that it requires to plunder value for free. And so, yeah, internalize things, right? Make it circular, but that's not compatible with capital's, need for surplus value extraction. And the reason that our economy is presently not circular is precisely because capital requires that outside, precisely because it requires that surplus value extraction. And so there's a tension here, and I think that we can promote circularity, but recognize this requires a deeper engagement with the structure of our economy and rethinking things quite fundamentally. Another thing to keep in mind is that only a portion of our material throughput can even be recycled. Net additions to building stocks, that's not recycled. Our energy sources like fossil fuels and food, that's not recycled. All of that is irreversibly degraded in the process of consumption. So in fact, only a small fraction, maybe 10 to 20% of our material throughput is really recyclable in any meaningful sense. So yes, let's recycle that as much as possible, but recognize that in a growth-oriented system, it's going to keep extracting from the outside, and that process has to be slowed down. Has to be made ecological in the sense of the critical observation of steady-state economic theory is that your economy should never extract more than ecosystems can safely regenerate, and never waste more than ecosystems can safely absorb. And I think those two principles are what we need to adopt here, right? Rather than just playing with the rhetoric of circular economy.
Yeah. I just want to chime in on this idea of growth, which several of the commentaries mention. It's a tricky word. It gets us in trouble, right? We want to degrowth the global throughput of material and energy. But we want to grow many other things. I want to grow other things, investment in caring and commons and looking after education, et cetera, right? So one way that we're thinking about it is distinguishing rhythms of growth, right? First of all, biological growth is great. I mean, that's what we're all about, right? Seeds grow into trees, human infants grow into adults. At some point, each organism stops growing, then dies and decays. We call this the life cycle, right? There's growth as part of the life cycle. And these individual life cycles are part of larger systems, forests, families, cities, which interact with other historical factors to grow, to decrease, et cetera, right? That's really different from what Jason described in his opening talk when he actually mentioned two different types of growth. One is endless growth, right? Even endless linear growth. Let's say every single year we're going to add 10 million more acres deforested. 1 year, 10 million, et cetera. That doesn't happen in nature, right? The plant doesn't keep growing up until like Jack's beanstalk into the clouds. A baby embryo doesn't grow into a giant up there at the top of the beanstalk. Nature isn't about endless growth. And it's also not, actually, we do have some cases of growth out of place, right? A cancer, cells growing out of place, viruses, maybe people talk about invasive plants, but they have some kind of limit, right? At some point, the host of the cancer dies, right? The population of the virus either dies or becomes resistant. The invasive plant or animal degrades or transforms the habitat to the point where it's no longer hospitable to them, right? So there's some kind of limits on that. And then I'm getting to the last type of growth that Jason mentioned again. So there's cyclical growth, which is wonderful, which is what nature is about. There's endless sort of linear growth. And then there's that damn compound growth, which we're all learning about now in the pandemic. Because if we, let's say out of 10 people, one infects another, we have 10 people, then we have one more, we have 11. The next day, we're not going to have one more, we're going to have 1.1 more because it's 10% of the 11, right? And so we keep growing in a compound way, compound interest on your credit card, and the compound growth that Jason mentioned at 3% a year that doubles our economy in 20 some years, right? And so it's hard when we use the word growth because growth is such a beautiful word, right? I want to grow personally and my maturity, and we want our flowers to grow. So I don't know how to get out of that dilemma, but I thought I would just share some of the conversations that we're having about trying to disentangle nurturing growth and sort of evil cancerous growth.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. It's one that I have also thought a lot about, because it's one that almost always comes up. And so what's interesting to me about this is that, people will say, why don't we just say, and in fact, in a way, I almost did this in my talk, and I had to change a word to make sure I didn't, but, why don't we just say, let's grow the, good things, and then, degrow bad things. Like, why use the term degrowth when it just sounds like everything's going to get smaller, and that sounds horrible, right? Well, I think the crucial way to get through this conundrum is to recognize what we actually mean when we say economic growth, right? So, for example, if we want to expand public health care, so take the USA. If we transition the USA from a private healthcare system to a public healthcare system, that is not economic growth. It's not. In fact, it's probably the opposite of economic growth in the sense of, you're going to curtail corporate profits really significantly. The sector will effectively, in terms of the way that in terms of GDP, it contracts. Okay, so yes, we can talk about let's expand our access to healthcare, et cetera, but that's not actually growth. We use the term degrowth to specifically speak against the economic definition of growth. Okay, which is the expansion of exchange value. So when we talk about expanding use values, we can call it whatever we want, but we have to be clear analytically about what growth means, which is an expansion in exchange value, and that's what we're trying to push against. But yeah, I mean, for those of you who wrestle with this, I totally get it. Like, it's not exactly straightforward, and the reason is because there's so much confusion around the word growth itself, right? Like, we just think that growth could mean anything good, when in fact growth means something very specific. Specifically commodification, the expansion of commodification.
Good.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll just quickly address one question that Dennis De Bernardi writes: are there any serious economists and politicians who nowadays still actually believe in homo economicus? That thing has already been heavily debunked 20 years ago when I was a student. Good for you. Most people I meet, they haven't been debunked. One of the most common responses I hear to degrowth is, oh my God, that's against human nature. Like, humans are pre-programmed to constantly want more and more and more. Like, hoarding is some kind of like natural thing, right? And this competitive individual. And I think even if economists actually question some of the precepts, much of the economics I read still assumes that we are atomic individual actors competing to get somewhere, and even that influence our biology. When we look, for example, at the textbooks that talk about reproductive biology, they talk about which of the sperms of the man is going to go faster to make the race and conquer the egg of the woman, right? It's like the survival of the fittest. They're going to race through her vagina up into penetrate the egg. That is total BS. First of all, you need hundreds of thousands of sperm because the first ones are going to deal with some chemical reaction, whatever. It's like a team effort. That's the only way you can get pregnant. Anyone with infertility knows about that. It's not the survival of the one damn athlete who, anyway, the sprinter who makes it first. And well, there's more to it, but this assumption of the individual competitive human fighting for his own kin, his own descendants, his own maximization penetrates so much of our thoughts, of our literature, of our sciences, and our economy, that even there's technical economists that debunked it, and I'm glad Dennis's class did that. We still need to uproot it from our visceral desires and bodies, where we still feel that. It feels natural because it feels like an impulse in us, but that's not, it's an impulse that was planted in you and me.
There's a question. Would you like to continue? We don't have to.
Maybe
we can each say one last closing. How about that?
That would be a good idea.
There we go.
Thank you.
There's one question I want to make sure to address because I think it's quite an important one. Somebody basically says something along the lines of, this all sounds great from kind of almost technocratic perspective, but how do you actually make this happen when you have individuals, oligarchs, for example, is the word they use, who clearly benefit substantially from the status quo of the global economy and who are unlikely to go along with such changes, right? Well, so this is an important point. And I think the crucial thing here is that, like, this is not going to be an idea that emerges from social movements and academics and et cetera, and is just going to change the world automatically, right? This is going to require a political struggle, against individuals and companies and states that benefit tremendously from the present arrangements. And we can't there's no sugarcoating that, right? And I think that requires us to think about, who are the constituencies for degrowth? And this is where I think it's crucial that we emphasize this is a project of class liberation, okay? Like the working class is a powerful movement that is organized in many countries and can be a vehicle for this kind of thinking, okay? And I think that policies like the public job guarantee, a living wage, significant reductions in inequality, et cetera, are policies that working class movements can take hold of and champion as a key parts of a kind of post-growth or degrowth proposal, okay? So that's one thing. The second thing is this, is that, who has the most skin in the game in the question of ecological breakdown is marginal communities in the global north and communities of color across the world, specifically in the global south, right? And so to me, I think that we have to take inspiration from the anti-colonial movements, which is the single most powerful movements for global economic change in human history, where people from the poorest countries on the planet that have been ravaged by hundreds of years of brutal colonization managed to overthrow some of the most powerful states in the world effectively, forcing them to leave, and collectively organized to transform the global economy, at least for a few decades before structural adjustment undid all of their progressive gains, okay? But that's powerful. And to me, it's important that we recognize the colonial dimensions of ecological breakdown and mobilize our responses as an anti-colonial struggle, okay? So this requires solidarity between political movements in the global north and political movements in the global south. I think that's got to be crucial. And it's this kind of thing that has been the only thing that's ever achieved substantial economic change in human history, and is the only thing that ever will. So the anti-colonial movement, the civil rights struggle, to me, this is the inspiration we need. And recognize that this is fundamentally different than the typical green politics, which is retreat to your own individuality and try to consume less. Again, we do need that, sure. But ultimately, this has to be about the joys of solidarity and collective organizing, and collectively imagining a better world. And my favorite kind of analogy here is, again, the civil rights movement. Imagine you were in the USA during the segregation period against racism. It's not enough for you to go into your house and try privately to not be racist, right? It's not going to change anything. What you need, I mean, of course it's good. You should try to not be racist, but ultimately you have to get outside, build solidarities in your community, build social movements, and fundamentally change racist laws, which is what the civil rights movement did. That's no small accomplishment. And that's the kind of inspiration we have to take, I think.
It's a big challenge ahead, Jason. So, yeah, I'm with you. Everyone here, let's keep thinking about how to make those moves. Many of us would like to see societies become slower and more caring by design, not disaster. However, it looks like transitions will be unplanned and messy in conditions that we don't choose, like the ones we're living through right now with COVID and political instabilities. Amid bitter struggles over which paths to pursue through this pandemic and beyond it, powerful actors like the oligarchs Jason was just discussing are pushing to reconstitute the status quo, to defend this destructive, unequal degrowth or growth-driven world, right? Our abilities to ally in resistance and imagining new worlds are really vital, But I sometimes fear they're undermined by politics of fear and surveillance, xenophobia, and blame that are accelerating with this pandemic, right? As well as isolation that constrains common efforts. That's why Mathew, Rose, thank you so much for bringing us together, because these moments, they're so much more powerful for us when we're separated in our own homes to be together and think about these challenges. So in case, I guess my co-authors and I, we make a very immediate case for including degrowth in this allied front. And that is that its fundamental practices are desirable in themselves. Basically, living modestly in caring and cooperation, sharing convivial joy and togetherness, trying to build equitable and solidary communities, regenerating the environments in which we live. Even with no political victory in sight, people in wildly diverse contexts are already exercising and embodying caring degrowth worlds. And everyone on this video connection today can advance that movement right away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, for all of you who've participated, but also for Susan and Jason who've given their time so generously. And I can recommend both books that have been written. You can, Jason, what the title of yours was?
The title of mine is Less is More.
Less is More.
How degrowth can save the world. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the title. Publishers have power over that kind of thing.
Tell us about it. Susan.
The Case for Degrowth. It's short, it's easy to read. You can share it with your grandma and discuss it afterwards.
It is. It's part of a series by Polity, which is written for non-academics. It's an introduction to topics, and this is very important. On the other hand, I found Jason's book also at a level where I think most anyone will find it accessible. So I think we'll conclude here. And once again, thank you to everyone. Thank you also to Helle, Panke, and to the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. And I hope we'll see each other in the new year. Yes. And I think what both have said is very, very important. You know, do mind your own garden. But on the other hand, there's change is not going to happen there. It's going to happen on a broader prospect. So it means learning to organize. It's a big step. It's a difficult one due to all the individualization that has occurred in the last decades. So I wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year and whatever. And we'll see each other in 2021. Take care. Bye.